Right, it's odd to talk into the microphone when it's not amplified. So it's just a toy. I need it I have a sense of importance when I have a microphone.
I've never known Mike to need a sense of importance.
And yet I have one.
Thank you all for coming this evening. I assume that you have read Mike's bio. Professor Michael Munger from Duke University. He did, how many years did you do as department head? 10. So he's done time.
Think how long it seemed to them.
Exactly.
I mean, I've talked to your faculty. I know how long it seemed to them.
Yeah, well, it was 15 for them. They knew every minute. Mike is he's someone trained as an economist who teaches in a political science department. I'm someone trained as a political scientist who teaches in an economics department. He does it better than I do. So just read Mike's stuff and you will know most of how the world works. I especially recommend his pieces on Econ Live. The one, Bosses Don't Wear Bunny Slippers, is an absolute classic. And what's the one about bees?
It's the one about bees. So
anyway, any of them, read them. And if you listen to Econ Talk, you get to hear Mike fairly often. And on next week's episode, it's Mike interviewing Russ Roberts instead of the other way around.
It's a new sheriff in town.
It should be quite entertaining. And Mike works on really interesting things. Today in Bill's class, he was talking about public transportation in South America. In the faculty seminar, he was talking about what's really a voluntary transaction and what that means for entrepreneurship. And you're going to talk about the sharing economy tonight. So thank you, Mike. Mike and I are going to go fishing tomorrow afternoon, assuming that the weather holds in Idaho. So
we're going to go fishing anyway, Randy.
My interest was bringing him out to play and having him do some things like this on the side. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Could I get someone to turn on the... All right. So we did a podcast about the sharing economy. And I thought it would be interesting. I would like in a year or two to try to begin to write a book on this subject, but I don't know enough about it, and that will become quite clear as I go through my talk. So I'm hoping to learn quite a bit from you, because it's not even clear what the subject of the sharing economy is. It's like many of those buzzwords. Part of its attraction is its ambiguity. So, but I'll try to give what I think is the importance, maybe some of the drawbacks and some of the things that we can learn from the sharing economy. So it's in the news everywhere. And in fact, economists actually use that as a cover. And in some ways, the economy is always about sharing and exchange, because all prosperity comes from trade. And the expansion of trade is from division of labor. So the question is, what might be different about the sharing economy? And I want to claim that it could be a difference so fundamental that we've actually never seen anything like it in our lifetimes. So you can't avoid it even if you try, because many of the things that you actually care about and use and take for granted may not exist in 10 years because of the destructive power of the sharing economy. So the reason is that revolutions are destructive. The Neolithic revolution 10,000 years ago destroyed institutional patterns in which hunter-gatherers became agriculturalists. And when they became agriculturalists, it fundamentally changed the way that roving bandits might be able to take something that they had been planted. So if I'm a hunter-gatherer, I don't have very much, and there's not much of a return to theft or piracy. If you have a fixed Neolithic village and we've planted crops, the benefits to attack are greater. And in fact, David Friedman, the son of Milton Friedman, claims that the origins of the Neolithic Revolution were actually dogs. We couldn't have had property rights, he claimed, until we had dogs. And the reason is that it takes too long to make sure your neighbor is not coming over into your property to take your crops. But if you have a dog, you can't stop them from barking and biting. They're a barking and biting machine. They're territorial, they're barking and biting, and they care about you. And so a kind of small change, according to Friedman, he's saying this half tongue in cheek, but it's interesting to think about what a small change in relative prices might do for the way people live their lives, for the way people organize their lives. In the Industrial Revolution, the change that came about was because of the change in productivity, the realization of the potential of the division of labor. And the question is, what is it about the sharing economy that might wreak changes? I realize putting it in that list of three is pretty ambitious, because those other two are pretty big ones. So one of the things I want to mention at the outset, many of you are economists, know about Coase's theory of the firm. And what R.H. Coase, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, said was that the size of the firm would depend on transactions cost, and that firms would expand until at the margin, the last transaction organized within a firm costs just as much as buying something in the market. So every firm faces a make or buy decision. And the subject of the Boss Doesn't Wear Bunny Slippers piece that I wrote, that Koch Foundation now uses it in their orientation for new managers, asks the question, could there ever come a day when a boss doesn't have any employees? You could buy everything. You just sit home in bunny slippers, and in front of your computer, you buy stuff, and then you contract with people to put it together. You contract with other people to sell it, and that's all it takes to be a boss. When I wrote that nearly 10 years ago, I was kidding, of course. But as transactions cost to organize transactions in a reliable way come down, it becomes more plausible that working in traditional firms is less likely, because there's actually a lot of expense to do that. You have to travel there, there's organization costs. And so there was a commercial, and I looked and looked for it. I spent nearly 30 minutes looking for it, hoping I could find the clip. But an automobile company in Japan is looking for brake linings. And they have a traditional maker, and they ask this traditional maker, and it turns out that his price isn't very good, and they're angry, but they say, well, we've got this tradition. And a young man stands up and opens something that was then a pretty radical innovation. He had a laptop computer, because this was 10 years ago. And he said, I found a buyer in Texas. And so the guy sends an email and says, sayonara, y'all. He made brake linings. And it turned out that they could buy those brake linings much more cheaply from some guy in Texas that they didn't know. Well, markets generally are institutions for reducing the transactions cost of impersonal exchange. And the transactions cost of impersonal exchange are pretty high. There's all sorts of holdup. There's problems in affecting the exchange. There's a problem in actually transferring the money. But the sharing economy can eliminate all of those costs. Actually eliminate all of those costs. So when I buy something on eBay or Craigslist, I don't know the person. How do I reliably think that they'll actually perform the transaction? Well, their reputations. So we have things that are now separate, that are substitutes for the personalistic exchange we used to rely on to ensure the consummation of the exchange. So if you think 200 years ago, our stereotype of the way a suburban person might get meat, you go to the same butcher every week, you say, hey, Murray, how's the wife? Ah, she's terrible, you know. Here's, I kept this pork aside for you, it's good. And you know Murray, you know his wife. Now you can go someplace and buy meat or something that you're going to put in the mouth of your children without having any direct knowledge of that person, because of the reputational information that we get from the sharing economy. And the question is that as reliable? Will that kind of reputational information replace government background checks and maybe even licensing? We have a lot of occupational licensing requirements that are pretty expensive. To be a lawyer, to be a doctor, they largely serve as entry barriers. Maybe for lawyers and doctors it makes sense, but Louisiana requires nearly a year of college classes in order to get a license as a flower arranger. Now think of the consequences if flowers were poorly arranged. What would you do? Well, presumably reputation could take care of this. We don't need, but Louisiana does have, a state bureau of flower arranging licensing. Well, what would happen if they didn't have a state bureau of movies? Wait, they don't. You can just go and look at Rotten Tomatoes. So there's all sorts of licensing functions that we can get from the sharing economy that will limit the asymmetry of information that in the past have prevented what would have been mutually beneficial transactions. So maybe bosses will wear bunny slippers. The size of the firm may shrink. People's ability to work as freelancers may increase. Now, there's a number of problems that we'll have to solve, but we've moved a long way in that direction already. So, Airbnb, 40,000 people per day in 30,000 cities. And if you look at how it grew, it started in New York, and the premise was, when they first went to New York, that they could get a relatively small number, and hotels are very expensive in New York because there aren't very many. There's actually as many hotels in New York as there are in Chicago, but a lot more people stay in New York than stay in Chicago. But there's a lot of empty apartments. And if you had some easy way of reliably being able to use that, then that is a mutually beneficial transaction that was not taking place because of the costs of impersonal exchange. Well, Airbnb provides reputational and clearing information that ensures that the transaction is reliable. I'm sure that the person I'm staying with, 100 other people have stayed with them and all independently said it was okay. And the money that I pay, I won't be cheated out of. So what happened was that Airbnb started to grow until a huge number, in some cases more than 300,000 person nights per day are transacted on Airbnb. So total Airbnb guests have just skyrocketed, almost at a doubling pace. Kickstarter is another kind of sharing economy software. And what it does is reduce the transactions cost of finding people who might be interested in investing. And there you see the number of, they hit 1 million backers, and I don't remember her name, Amanda Palmer actually got $1.2 million to finance an album. Now, this is different from people buying the album. This is people buying a share of the album. And, you know, maybe it won't work, but it was very difficult for her to raise enough money in the traditional way to get a record company to take a chance on this. But this meant that her fans actually owned a piece of the record before it was made. So they get to make a bet on this. That's just something that's quite different. It actually appeals to people. Zipcar, you've probably seen it a number of places. One of the reasons why cars are so expensive is that they sit empty almost all of the time on really expensive pieces of real estate. That's two stupid things. You have a really expensive piece of capital that's sitting on a really expensive piece of real estate in Lower Manhattan. Parking spaces in Lower Manhattan cost $1 million for the parking space. Now, that seems like a lot. Now, maybe it's artificial restriction. If somebody builds a new parking deck, it wouldn't cost that much, but an existing one on street as part of adding to an existing condo, one recently sold for $1 million. Well, why not park the car? Why not have it moving all the time? And if you have enough of them, if you had enough of those cars, you're in a place where people could be renting them constantly. Lyft and Uber are two different car sharing companies. How many of y'all have used Lyft or Uber? Anyone over 30? My wife refused. We were in New York last weekend. It's just, I don't want to get in a car like that. I said, well, you look at the reputation, they actually can't have less than 4.5. Plus you can check. You can, in New York especially, it's a target rich environment. This person only has 40. No, that's not good enough. It's so great. And here's a question. Why is it that taxis suck so much? The experience of being in a taxi is so awful. My wife actually insisted we take a taxi from LaGuardia to my son's hipster apartment in, he goes to NYU as a graduate student, so it was hopeless. He went to the dark side. So we took a taxi, and I asked the driver, is it okay if I use a card? Because they've got a credit card thing where you can use it from the back. He says, no, no, no. Grabs my card, comes around, he runs the card, and then gives himself a 50% tip and hands me back the card. I tried to file a complaint with the New York Taxi Commission, but you have to appear in person. There's your answer. That's why taxis suck so much. But there is an interesting question. If you paid for a taxi medallion, $800,000, $1.5 million for a taxi medallion, why is it, of course, you're going to object to the fact that Uber drivers don't have to pay that. So what this means is that I think the most interesting aspect of Uber is that the software allows you so quickly to locate and pay for a service compared to a taxi where you call and some person who doesn't speak English tells you that they'll be there in 45 minutes and then it's an hour and 15 minutes. You have to give them directions. They won't go the way that you want them to go. And then there's a long negotiation at the end about how you're going to pay. Uber, you press a button. They're usually there before you get to the curb. We did it inside a restaurant. We walked to the curb. The car was waiting. We get in. He already knew our destination. Drove to the destination. We just got out and said, thanks. So it's seamless. Why don't taxis adopt this software? What is it that's the value proposition for Uber? Is it that they're able to undercut the costs of taxis, which is true? Is it that their software connection is less costly, which is true? Or is it their surge pricing algorithm, which is also an advantage? One of the reasons that Uber got in trouble this past winter was that there were several blizzards in New York. Now, who's the more moral person? The person who's sitting in his apartment looking at his TV and sees, wow, there's a blizzard outside. It must really be terrible to be outside. I'm going to turn the heater up and watch something else because this is too depressing. Or the second person who's watching his TV and sees there's a blizzard and says, hot damn, I'm going to go get in my car for money. I think it's hard to tell a story where the first person is more moral. The second person, suppose you were an omniscient, benevolent social planner. You would whisper to people, go get in your car and provide necessary transport services. Well, that's what the second guy did. He heard that whisper and he went and did it. Now, it's true that he had not been washed in the milk of human kindness. He did it because he wanted to make more money, but still he went out and provided a really useful service. And so the people out there who complained are imagining an alternative universe where there was a taxi with no one in it that would pick them up and charge the usual price. That wasn't true. Either the taxi drivers had all gone home or they were full. There's no taxis. So the price of a taxi is actually infinity. And so whatever the surge pricing was, which might admittedly be $75 to go a mile, is still cheaper than infinity. So those are three parts of what might be the value proposition for why Uber is successful. I actually think that the most important one is the second, and I'm going to try to tell you why. I don't think that the undercutting taxis because they have these traditional barriers is really the most important part. So there are a lot of people that complain about that. I think that that's not only mistaken, but so fundamentally mistaken that it misunderstands the sharing economy. Those batteries. So 52% of Americans have rented, borrowed, or leased the kind of items that people usually own in the past 2 years. I'm not having much luck. 83% they would share these items if they could do so easily. Now, what sort of items are we talking about? Well, apartments, cars, bicycles. Could be electric drills. How many of y'all have an electric drill at home? The average, the median total lifetime use of an electric drill is less than 20 minutes. I mean, you think about it, if you use a drill for a minute, that's a pretty long time. You know, maybe you're drilling through metal or something, or you're putting something into concrete. But for most people, you're making a couple holes so you can put anchors in a wall and then put up a picture, or you're putting together something with screws that's wood. 20 minutes would be a pretty long time. So half of them are used less than that lifetime before they get thrown away. Why don't you rent them out? Well, they're not really expensive enough to make the transactions cost of going through renting it out yourself. You could say drill for rent wherever in your apartment, and people will think you're nuts. Whereas if you say car for rent, okay, I understand what that means. Well, the reason that we don't see drills for rent is that we don't have the software to reduce the transactions cost to the point where that otherwise mutually beneficial transaction would take place. There are plenty of people who would pay you 50 cents to rent your drill for a day, and you'd happily take it if it didn't cost you anything, and if you got it back without the drill being damaged. In fact, you do it 20 times, you get 10 bucks. That's a fair amount of the purchase cost of the drill, and it's pretty hard to break a drill. So the deciding line about where the margin is about renting or buying really just depends on the transactions cost of consummating this exchange. Because it is a mutually beneficial exchange, just the transactions cost are too high. So why sharing? One argument that people have made is the recession. So it meant that people looked around for a cheaper way to do things. And I think that was a precipitating event. There's nothing important about it, but it may be the explanation for why it started happening 2006, 2007, 2008, rather than some other time. But what really happened was that we had technology in the form of software and hardware in the form of mobile phones that allowed us to start to reduce the transactions cost of sharing. So the precipitating event is the recession, but the benefits to sharing had always been there. What happened was now I have a mobile phone that people could write apps for, and we started to have apps that reduced transactions cost to the point where it made economic sense to engage in these activities. We have a bunch of stuff we don't use. If you think of all the stuff you have that's relatively durable that you don't use, I mean, drills are an excellent example because people don't use them for very long. But you've got stuff you got when you got married, you don't use very often. We have a pasta maker that I use at least once a year. And you can make quite a bit of pasta. You can make about as much pasta as you want for a while, and then you buy it at the store again, because it takes a long time to make pasta. But we don't need a pasta maker in every house. One per block is probably enough. And some sort of forced sharing arrangement would be icky. But renting it out, if the transactions cost were low, would make perfect sense. We actually have storage unit. I have two sons that have moved home unexpectedly and then away not soon enough a couple of times. One of them is living there now, and I'm going to kill him. He graduated from Duke in May. Damn. But anyway, our storage unit looks a lot like this because he's got a bunch of stuff, and he might use it, and we might use some of it, and it's actually more than big enough to park a car in if we didn't have so much stuff. So the self-storage industry is actually a $22 billion industry. That's bigger than the total Hollywood box office sale. See what I did there? Box office is the storage unit. No, don't thank me. It's okay. So it's a box office comparison is where I've been looking all day long. I've been looking forward to this, and you've got nothing. You've got nothing for me. So once you start thinking of how nice it would be to have sort of a generic storage place where you could put your stuff, software eats the world. So Mark Andreessen, or P. Marca as I know him, because we're Twitter friends. So when we write back and forth on Twitter, had an article in the Wall Street Journal in 2011 where he said software eats the world. And the Industrial Revolution caused the closing of all sorts of artisanal manufacturing facilities. So you have a shoemaker, a cobbler. That person can't possibly compete with a production line of 10 people who cut part of the shoe, sew part of the shoe together, assemble the rest of the shoe, shine it, put it in a box. You can make a whole bunch more shoes, maybe with a slight decline in quality, but with a dramatic decline in price. So that means many people now could afford shoes that couldn't before. All the cobblers lost their jobs. Well, a whole bunch of people are going to lose their jobs because of the sharing revolution. I started to ask when was the last time you saw a record store, but of course there are no record stores, and that's not even true. In Brooklyn now there are a bunch of stores where hipsters go to buy vinyl. We should just burn the place. We should just napalm it. But sort of traditional record stores no longer exist in the sense you go there to buy CDs because you can order them from Amazon. But in fact, you don't even do that. You probably rent them, or you buy them on iTunes and store them in the cloud. I actually made a remarkable discovery the other day. I buy, and my sons, God, they pissed me off. They put CDs into the CD player in the car, and then they'll pull them out and just put them in the glove compartment or without the cover, so they get all scratched up. And so I don't have any of my music because they're all scratched up and I can't play it. I didn't realize that since I bought all of them on Amazon, I have 60 CDs on Amazon Music Library in the cloud. I have all of them. I can download them whenever I want. And I had no idea. So I'm not going to buy any more CDs. There's no reason why the content should be on some physical medium. And in fact, I don't even need to download it and put it on my drive. I can leave it in the cloud and just play it from there, as long as I have some platform that will play it. There's no reason for me to store anything. So all of the people who made a living by buying stuff that people would then store are going to be out of business. It's going to be catastrophic. So all of those, how many of y'all use Dropbox? I really can't imagine not using it anymore. I haven't stored anything on my hard drive in a long time. Now, if a student tells me that they had a paper they had to turn in, but they can't because they had a hard drive crash, you need to just quit college. You don't have a hope. Your hard drive crashed? Really? I mean, a lot of people even run their software remotely, but surely you can store all of your actual data on somewhere in the cloud. So we don't even really need hard drives. It's not clear we even really need intelligence. What we may need is some fast mechanism for moving things up and down. So it'll get cheaper and cheaper and more remote, and you can concentrate intelligence and storage somewhere else. But our homes have gotten quite a bit bigger. So the average size in 1950 was 983. Average size now is 2480. Now that's for single family homes, and a fair number of people don't live in single family homes. They live in rentals. But still, for single family homes that are owned, that are occupied by their owners, they're gigantic, and there's empty rooms. Why not rent them out? Because that's really creepy. That's why. I mean, it's creepy for you to have someone in your house, and it's creepier for them to be in your house. They don't want to be there. Except that a lot of people have found that if you make some pretty minimal arrangements, you can actually stay almost completely separate. So my friend Mario works for IHS, lives very near the National Science Foundation. And he actually rents out 2 or 3 nights a week to visiting NSF scholars who come to NSF to be on panels. His wife still lives in Mexico. He has a 3-bedroom apartment, and he's arranged one so that it has its own bathroom. He had way too much capacity, and now this pays almost half his rent. He pays almost half his rent by doing this. And people are paying $50, $60 a night instead of $210 a night for some lousy hotel. And he has really excellent tequila. So they'll have a tequila or two that night. So word gets around, yeah, stay with Mario. You can have the Gusano. So we live more and more in isolation. The number of people who are living and dining by themselves has doubled over the last 40 years. We haven't talked about dining yet, but there's a number of software programs where you can say, I'm going to fix dinner, come on over. And 20, 30, 40 bucks, and a few people do. And nobody under 40 would do this. But it's sort of fun to have, if you're in a city where you don't know anybody, kind of a ready-made dinner party. So 2 or 3 other young people show up. You make sure that you look at the person's reputation, but the reputation probably works. And so for 20 bucks, you get a really interesting dinner and interesting dinner conversation with no other obligations. You'll probably never see them again unless you decide to trade digits. It's a way of finding and sharing something that we used to take for granted. So maybe for a lot of people in large cities that are kind of anomic, we can say the real problem is the decline of family life. Maybe that's right. But a solution is sharing. And so thinking of this, I think thinking of this as an exchange, as a purely economic exchange, is probably the wrong way to think about it. It's more like a low-cost way to achieve cooperation. So it's a social, local, mobile revolution. And technology enables that growth. Sharing is at the core of the tech growth, but mobile and local enable totally new types of sharing services. So it's the fact that it's local that makes all the difference. So once you start to think about Uber, you realize, well, the interesting thing about Uber is probably not that they're delivering transportation services. What's interesting about Uber is that it's a platform for delivering services in a way that's really, really fast and cheap and reliable. So I was at Colorado School of Mines for a fee conference this summer, and I got pitched by a kid who didn't think I was going to invest. He just wanted practice pitching to an old guy. I realized later, thanks, kid. But he had a software platform that he was going to use that was in some ways like Uber. It was in Colorado, in Denver, to deliver high-quality marijuana and snacks very quickly to people that were too high to go out and get the marijuana and snacks that they needed. Not surprisingly, it was called Duber. I submit to you, this is brilliant. There's no reason that I have to get in the car when it comes to my house. So there's people that drive, these are relatively non-perishable things. So he's got several bags of Buds and Doritos and Oreos. And so I say, man, we got to call the doctor. Doctor says he's coming, but you got to pay in cash. No, I have Duber. I can pay with a credit card. And in fact, I see there's several here, and he's downstairs now. Let's go. You go down. You've already paid for it. He gives you the Bud, the Oreos, and the Doritos. Or you're working on your car. You're all greasy. And being an idiot, you broke the part that you had purchased that you were trying to put on. And you think, man, I've got some other stuff to do, but I don't want to have to go back to the auto parts store. So you go to your auto part Uber delivery, and select the part. And it turns out that they've got a delivery service. They've contracted with Uber. And it's there in 20 minutes. So we're used to ordering things on Amazon. And they're there tomorrow, which is pretty cool. So who should be worried about Uber? The taxi companies? No, Amazon. Amazon should be worried about Uber. It's a delivery platform for products and services. So Amazon was a book company. They sold books. Does anybody remember that? Ryan. I remember. It was books. It was books. And people were saying, it's a catastrophe that the Barnes & Noble is going to go out of business. Of course, a little while before that, Barnes & Noble had been the bad guys because they drove out the mom and pop. But now, of course, this was the very fabric of American society. Because we can go to the Barnes & Noble and have an espresso and sit and share. And now it's nothing like that. Well, I can buy books, but it turned out that what Amazon sold was not books. What Amazon actually sold was transactions. And so if you look, more than half of the companies you're likely to see on the web that has a web page where you can buy stuff. If you look at the bottom, it'll say AWS. AWS is Amazon Web Services. That's how they make money. They sell software. Amazon doesn't sell stuff. They sell software that sells transactions. Amazon needs to worry, though, because Uber is a really great alternative platform for selling services, for selling transactions. Because it's faster than Amazon, it's a lot less clunky, and it's really good at handling the reputation problems. So Amazon, even with Prime, it's a day or two before you get the stuff. You can get that part that you broke or something that you need from the hardware store in no time, because all that happens is you say what you need, you press the button, whoever's closest, whatever Uber driver is closest to the hardware store goes and picks it up and brings it to you, and it all clears on your credit card because the software handles all that. All of those contracts are written in advance. So this one is called Cookening. There's a number of others where you can either attend or host home-cooked meals. And what they're really selling is companionship. Now, restaurants have not surprisingly complained about this because they don't pay taxes, they don't have bricks and mortar. It's like food trucks in a way, only even worse, even more nightmarish. And to be fair, a number of homes in New York that had dining rooms that would hold 20 people hired very expensive visiting chefs and charged $500 per meal. So it's very close then to being competitive with a restaurant, except that you get to go into one of these apartments on Park Avenue that you would never get to go into and pretend for a little bit that you were invited. Whereas in fact, you're paying $500 to be there. But given that you've been paid $500, the doorman lets you in, you get to go in. It's a really tremendous meal and you get to talk to a bunch of other interesting people. So it's the companionship. Whereas in a restaurant, you wouldn't get that. It's a different thing. There's a lot of little chores that you have around the house that it'd be really great if you could find someone to do, but it's usually too hard to find them. The tradition in North Carolina is if you need yard work done, you get in your pickup truck and you go drive down by the Home Depot. And if you speak Spanish, you can find several people that will help you. This is not a great way to do things. Plus, La Migra will arrest you if they catch you, because it's not like you're paying taxes or anything. Well, there are easy ways to handle this with software. The only thing that keeps people from saying, I want somebody to help me rake my leaves, is the transactions cost of finding someone who was willing to participate in that transaction. If you have a list of people who are willing and you have a way of paying them that's reliable, it would happen. It's only the transactions cost that's stopping it. As transactions costs fall, the size of firms will get smaller and smaller, but the number of mutually beneficial transactions that take place will grow larger and larger. So, Yerdle. Anybody ever used Yerdle? Basically, anything that you want to share or rent out and not own. There's no limits on it. It's a kind of Craigslist for drills, mixers. If you're in a small apartment and you need a mixer because you want to make a cake, a mixer is really expensive, and so you have some sucky one that actually doesn't fit in the bowl very well. Or you can rent a nice one for $10 for half a day, or that's all you need it for. WikiHouse, open source construction, so you can start with blueprints, but the blueprints are actually specifically embedded in a software that allows you to change it, and it updates the measurements and materials. When you think about it, that's just obviously useful. But it means that architects are going to say, this should be illegal. They don't have a license. Well, maybe it should. So a couple of times now, I've raised this question of property rights. So let me raise it as a possible problem here at the end. Does anybody know what a sabot is? Sabot is a wooden shoe, a clog. The word sabotage comes from the practice in the Netherlands and France during the Industrial Revolution of peasants taking off their wooden sabot and throwing it into the machine to break it. So sabotage is using your sabot to break the machine. So a lot of people, and that was a drag on the Industrial Revolution. Well, it looks like the taxi companies and the traditional companies that depend on licensing are trying to sabotage the sharing economy. And let's look at it for a second from their perspective. I have 35 acres of pine woods south of Pittsboro, North Carolina. There's a lot of beautiful animals on it. I go there to admire them and kill them so I can eat them. There's also a whole lot of trees. It's a pine forest, a pine plantation that we bought from Weyerhaeuser. Pine trees they're disturbingly cheap if you want to sell them, but we're waiting until they grow large enough that we can use them for saw timber, for pine to make 2x4s for houses. But it'll be 20 years or so yet before they're large enough. Suppose I go down to visit. It's almost hunting season, so I will. I go down there to visit, and I hear chainsaws. I think, what the heck? And I walk in a couple hundred yards, and I see a logging operation. Guys are cutting down my trees, and they're putting them on trucks and hauling them away to sell. I say, whoa, 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 this is my property. I paid for this. Y'all can't do that. They say, no, this is a really big benefit to consumers. Think how much cheaper we'll be able to sell these trees than if we had to pay for the license to own this land. We're just taking the trees. You can have the land. We're just taking the trees. Well, you can see where I'm going with this. If I'm Uber, then in effect, I'm saying I don't need to pay for that taxi medallion. Well, I expect when I call the county sheriff and say that there are trespassers who are taking my trees, and they're my trees because I have a piece of paper that the state says they will protect my trees. I call the sheriff's office. I expect men with guns to come right away, fast, and they will. I actually know a number of the sheriffs in the area. We've gone out shooting together. They will show up, and they will be heavily armed because the U.S. government has provided them with all sorts of military equipment. So men with guns will show up to protect the property right that I have as a consequence of having this piece of paper that says it's mine. Now, how did I get that? I paid money for it. And then the state put its stamp of approval saying, we will protect this property right. How is that different from a taxi medallion? Taxi medallion said that if you pay for this, we will make sure that no one else, up to beyond the limit of how many taxi medallions there are, is allowed to drive a taxi. Well, except now that we will. That doesn't seem right. Why don't men with guns come to arrest Uber drivers? Because they don't have a taxi medallion. Aren't they encroaching just the same way that the guy with the chainsaw was taking mine? Well, I think the answer is no, but I'm not so sure. So I think that I want to argue that there's a difference between property in the traditional sense and what is in effect a regulatory giving. A regulatory taking, by and large, we don't compensate for. So under the Fifth Amendment, if you take the full amount or value of the land, then you're obliged to compensate. But if you pass a law saying you can't cut down your trees because there's a red cockaded woodpecker, which is another reason I carry a shotgun when I visit my land. So if there were red cockaded, but there's not, there wouldn't be. These are loblolly pines. They're loblolly pines. There wouldn't, they only live in old growth pine forests. So I would never do that. But I've heard rumors. So they can say, wait, there's red cockaded woodpeckers in your pine plantation. You may not cut them down. You can keep the land and we're not going to pay you, but this is a regulatory taking. Well, a taxi medallion is a regulatory giving. It's just a negative taking. And if they had, when they decide to sell more taxi medallions, they don't have to compensate. So the distinction that I would make is there's a difference between property, which is an absolute, and a regulatory taking or giving. So it's not that the taxi medallion has zero value. It just has less value than it had before. Except that in Chicago, which also has a medallion system, they recently tried to have an auction with a starting price of $500,000 and they sold zero. Whereas they had sold taxi medallions at $800,000. So at $300,000 less than what had been the going price, no one made a bid. So it's a pretty significant loss. So the question is, what's going to happen in the evolution of the sharing economy to national firms that in good faith paid a contract that said men with guns will come if somebody violates this? Because they actually obeyed the law by buying that taxi medallion. But let me say the thing that I want to emphasize, and that is we shouldn't get too caught up in the transportation service as being the core of what is Uber's value proposition. That's why I think that this is a fairly short-run thing. What really is Uber's value proposition is the reduction in transactions costs that will allow thousands and thousands more mutually beneficial transactions to take place. Just a proliferation of mutually beneficial transactions in a way that means long-term contractual employment relations may largely disappear, because that's the alternative. That's what R.H. Coase posited as the alternative. We can either buy things on the spot market, or we can have long-term contracts, which is an employment relationship. Well, employment relationships may disappear more and more. And to the extent that that's true, that software eats the employment relationship, the sharing economy may very well be a transformation that's every bit as important in the way that we live as the Industrial Revolution was around the 1800s. Thank you, and I'd be happy to have questions.
I guess one question I had is, do you foresee this becoming something that creates big businesses as big sharing businesses, or instills more and more small business growth?
I'm with Tyler Cowen on this. There may not be any more big businesses. There may be some valuable businesses. Facebook doesn't have many employees. It's really valuable, but it doesn't have very many employees. Twitter doesn't have many employees, but it's really valuable. So the thing is, since you can contract, the whole point is, since you can contract and these things scale, then the problem that we may have is traditional employment may disappear. So if by big you mean lots of employees, no. If by big you mean with lots of customers, then yes. The problem is that customers will be incredibly fickle, because as soon as there's some lower transactions cost way of accomplishing this, they will. So I actually have an article that I've been writing for David Henderson for the Liberty Fund page, and the title of it is Comparative Advantage, an Idea Whose Time Has Passed. We have this conception when we teach economics that who should build what? And the answer is whatever is your comparative advantage. Well, comparative advantage in Ricardo's example had to do with the meteorological conditions in England and Portugal. But most of the time now, cost advantages are endogenous with respect to human action. So northern Alabama, there were 3 counties in northern Alabama that produced almost half of the socks that were purchased in the entire world in the 70s and 80s. There are no socks produced there now. Almost all of, if you go to Walmart, the socks that you will buy will be from Datang, China. 2/3 of all the socks in the world are produced in Datang, China. It's not because of climate. It's because there was a concentration of division of labor there that produced a gigantic increase in production, but a decline in world employment in socks. And so the general answer is productivity destroys employment. And this is extremely productive software. And so it's going to destroy employment in all sorts of ways. So what we may have to rethink is our commitment to a successful economy producing jobs, and thinking that a successful economy instead produces satisfaction. Jobs are a means to an end. And so I think for a lot of young people, the idea that you could work 20 hours a week and still have a pretty satisfactory life sounds pretty good. And in fact, for my son, living at home working 20 hours a week would be a big increase. So if you think of an economy as producing satisfaction, then yes, there'll be a bunch of big firms. But if the economy's job is to produce jobs, we may be in trouble. We may fundamentally rethink how it is that we spend our lives. I'm just not convinced that that's a bad thing. And here's the reason. In the Stone Age, everybody was employed. Everybody spent dawn to dusk trying to get enough food not to die. And many of them failed. But it was employment. So what we've had is an increase in productivity that has reduced employment but created leisure and activities that we can do during leisure that we all find very enjoyable. So there may be short-run big firms. I think it's interesting that we have mom and pop, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, Uber within a relatively short period as what might be, and obviously this is speculative about Uber, but some sort of software like Uber that replaces Amazon, which now seems, the contrarian view of this is as soon as a company seems so large that it will inevitably monopolize forever, that's when you should sell its stock. Because that's the time when something else is going to replace it. So Uber or some sort of Uber model is a better way of delivering services than what Amazon has. Because you've got this army of people who can make the delivery.
No, I'm not sure where you're at on this, but I know a lot of economists have said that this disrupting influence of the sharing economies will also produce rapid attrition and rapid exchange. And I wonder what your thoughts are on how that will affect us. There's a psychological aspect right now associated with brands and well-known companies. Is that something we'll move, or can we move beyond that?
Well, one could certainly give a whole talk just on that question. One of the things that may get destroyed is our traditional conception of intellectual property. And there's 3 categories of intellectual property to keep in mind. There's trademark, copyright, and patent. A trademark is actually a benefit to the consumer. So if my watch says Rolex, I actually was offered a Rolex watch in Lower Manhattan for $20. No, it's really cheap. It's a special sale. Yeah, it's a special sale. All right, thank you. It says Rolex right on it. Well, trademarks are a way of ensuring to the consumer that what the contents of the product say they are actually are. A copyright is a protection to the producer, but it's in the particular form. So I have some software, you can't literally copy the code, but you can reverse engineer the idea. Whereas a patent is, I'm actually trying to claim unique ownership for the idea. And so some of the big patent fights lately have been where someone tried to patent the I swipe right, and that means something different than if I swipe left. Well, if you can patent those things, you can really retard technological innovation. But if I can copyright the software that I wrote that makes swipe left and swipe right mean something, that's more plausible. And if I'm the only one that can make an iPhone, it actually guarantees that the quality that I put into an iPhone will be received by the consumer and that nobody else can buy it. So what I worry about is that the investments that are made in trademarks that until now, when you think of advertising, if you do a taste test with Coke, Pepsi, and Royal Crown Cola, a substantial number of people in a blind taste test choose Royal Crown Cola. If you let them see the brands, no one does, because only a herb would drink Royal Crown Cola. So they all have to pick Coke or Pepsi because Coke and Pepsi have created through advertising and an image of, well, I want to be the sort of person that other people see as drinking Coke or Pepsi. Well, those things aren't worthless, and we want people to invest in trademarks. But if we start to churn where there's constantly new products, then that investment in trademark may start to disappear. And it may just be that I'm old, but I worry about our ability to ensure to consumers that they're actually receiving what they think they're paying for. Because if we can't do that, the exchange won't take place. But the alternative might be, instead of an FBI background check and a license, I've got 1,100 reputation marks, and that means that the product that I make, whatever it is certified by 1,100 people that says, yes, you can trust this guy. So we may start to trust reputations more than we trust trademarks. So so a number of people have suggested that. And well, not surprisingly, the head of LinkedIn think that that's really important. What you need to do is develop your personal trademark. And of course, that's how he makes money, is by having people do that on LinkedIn. But it's not absurd. But it's a good question, because we tend to think in terms of trademarks and products. And if there's just a flurry of replacement, we would need something else to guarantee the quality of the transaction.
So you've talked a lot about competition against businesses. What about, say, like social norms and communities? I come from a very small town. We just share drills and sanders and all we need. Does this also have innovation in cultures and social norms?
One of the problems with these sorts of innovations, as I said, is that they are corrosive of institutions that we actually value. And so the village blacksmith or the village cobbler had an important position before the Industrial Revolution. And then that's gone. You had to go to some factory to buy it, and you were robbed of this chance. Or Murray the butcher. Now I go and I don't know the butcher. And it actually meant something personally. So suppose sharing a sander or a generator, it just understood because we're a relatively small group, it's long-term, it's repeat business. I'll expect you to loan me something if I need it, and I know you will. So it's an equilibrium in the sense of mutually fulfilled expectations. But then we get this software that makes it very cheap for me to rent this stuff, for you to rent it out. And I go to you and say, can I borrow it? And you say, well, no, I rented it out already. And in fact, it would cost me whatever I could rent it out for to let you use it. So yeah, you can use it, but you got to rent it. You think, well, that's not right. And it's not. It violates the norms. But software eats norms too. And that might be a bad thing. The problem is the logic of reduced transactions cost is not, there's no telos, there's no improvement. It's just that it's irresistible. There's no way to prevent people from making these decentralized, bilateral, mutually beneficial exchanges if the transactions costs come down. But it means that the alternative ways that we used to organize these systems of cooperation. So if you think of it more, you're asking about a system of cooperation that's an alternative to market exchange. Market exchange eats that. And that might be a bad thing. I want you all to keep doing this. Make him walk back and forth every time.
So you talked a little bit about potentially destroy life, what we know is like the common working lifestyle. And you also talked about how there won't be large companies, there will be valuable companies. Does that, if this path which you have suggested, if this continues at the trajectory that it looks like it might, does that mean that there will basically be two types of people? There will be like the Zuckerbergs and the person who owns like the block cake mixer. Like, will that just create a huge disparity in the types of career, like the types of incomes?
Yes, it would. I think the first group is larger than Mark Zuckerberg, but it's Mark Zuckerberg and all the other people who know how to code in Python.
Yeah.
So if you know how to code, that means that you could work on jobs. So I just post, I want code written for this. There's certain standards for how it has to run. We agree how to check it out. Then there are other people who will have a much harder time getting access to the sort of value creating transactions that we're thinking of. But that's basically Tyler Cowen's thesis in The Great Stagnation. So where the Great Stagnation comes from is that we stop getting this dynamic job growth because we can produce so much value because these technologies are so productive. So it's always been true that productivity kills jobs. China lost more jobs than any other country between 1995 and 2005, by far. So we complain about our jobs being shipped to China. Well, you should think about China as 1,000 women in a room with sewing machines. And then 10 years later, there's 7 guys operating large machines that produce 10 times as much apparel or clothing. So they lost a lot of jobs too. Productivity always destroys jobs. The difference here is it's not clear where the people who had worked in traditional jobs would find their next job unless they have access to the means of creating value in the new economy. And so, yes, that I think Tyler has a point in The Great Stagnation. He's not completely pessimistic though, because yes, people will have to live on less, but they'll be able to. Because I won't need to store stuff. I'll be able to rent it very cheaply. If I want a car, I can rent one for a day for $30. So and that includes insurance. So the things that if it breaks down, somebody else will fix it, because that's all built into the fact that we're using it intensively. Cost of living falls dramatically. So that's the benefit. Still, the costs of this do not fall equally. Some people will pay more cost than others because they won't have the kind of traditional jobs. And particularly for people who are older than 40 that are reluctant to think about the absence of that kind of security, that's pretty tough. May I say one more thing about a software that I didn't mention yet, which I think may be the most radical, and I was only going to bring it up if I had time, but I sort of do, and that's Bitcoin. So what is Bitcoin? It could be virtual money, and some people use it for money. What I think Bitcoin is death to lawyers. And the reason is that the blockchain technology provides me with a means of enforcing contracts with 100% certainty with no enforcement costs. So I contract with you and I agree to pay in Bitcoins. And I commit the quantity of Bitcoin that we agreed on. But it in effect is now in completely untouchable escrow. I cannot take it back and you can't get access to it. If you perform, and we agree that you perform the action that you agreed to do, I release it and you get it. If you don't perform and I say that you have not performed, I can take it back. So most of the things that we think about difficulties in contracts, hold up, negotiation, enforcement, all of those things are solved by Bitcoin. There's no reason that Bitcoin couldn't be denominated in dollars. It's open source software. There's nothing important about the currency aspect of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the most remarkable transaction enforcement software that the world has ever known. It will wipe out the need to write highly detailed contracts. So that's an example of the sort of thing where you shouldn't look at what most people say some software is about, because the software was created for a particular purpose that's an historical accident. But the software, once it exists, like Amazon that stopped selling books, Bitcoin could easily be denominated in dollars or euros. And since it's open source, we could be both. Bitcoin very quickly could be adapted to using the blockchain technology, could be adapted to using something else as the currency unit. There's nothing important about it being only Bitcoins. So that's the sort of thing, the sort of bait and switch, where we have a problem we want to solve, we write software for it, and then it turns out there's a whole bunch of other stuff that it's much more useful for.
All right, let's go ahead and thank Professor Munger for joining us this evening.
Yay, me!
Furthermore, thank you all for joining us as well. Nick, what's the next event on the calendar? October 5th, Steve Barth, who's a lobbyist in the Utah legislature, will be here at Strata speaking. What's that? October 1st. Okay. So at what time? 4:30. So thank you again all for coming, and we hope you enjoyed the evening. We very much did. So once again, thank you, Mike. And there is a lot of food left, so please eat. And thank you all again.